Victoria Cross is Britain's highest award for gallantry, or as it says on the medal itself, for valour. Some 628 Victoria Crosses were awarded during the 4 years of the Great War, including 51 here on the Somme in 1916. 628 actually sounds quite a large figure, but when one bears in mind that 5.5 million men wore the King's uniform from Britain, Ireland and from across the Empire, that makes the Victoria Cross an incredibly rare award. Consequently, it is with intense pride that regiment, county and hometown remember the award here on the Somme of the Victoria Cross to Private Theodore Veale of the 8th Battalion, the Devonshire Regiment.
The order was given for the formation of the 8th Battalion, the Devonshire Regiment, on the 7th of August 1914, just 48 hours after the declaration of war. The battalion started to assemble in Exeter, being built around a cadre of reservists who were left over after mobilisation and bringing the 1st Battalion up to wartime strength. Numerous volunteers also quickly joined alongside the reservists in order to make the battalion up to the required strength of 1,000 men. Amongst the first volunteers was the 21-year-old Theodore Veale from Dartmouth. The 8th Service Battalion was the Devonshire Regiment's equivalent of the PALs of the northern cities, and shared all the same difficulties of raising a new battalion in short order. Uniforms, weapons, equipment were all virtually non-existent to start with. Training, however, got underway, but before long the battalion was moved to Aldershot. Private Veale and the battalion were some 11 months into their existence when they were deployed to the Western Front in July 1915 to join the 7th Division, just in time for the bloody Battle of Loos, in which the 8th Battalion earned its spurs and impressed the veterans. After a winter of trench warfare in Flanders, the Devons moved to the Somme in early spring, taking over trenches around Mansell Copse near the village of Mametz.
The story of the 8th and 9th Battalions of the Devonshire Regiment in the Battle of the Somme begins across the valley at Mansell Copse. That was the front line from which they were to attack. Their job was with the 9th Battalion in the centre, flanked by the Gordon Highlanders and the border, to attack across that little valley down below, which was named by Captain Martin as the danger spot, because from up here they'll be raked by machine gun fire. The 8th Battalion and Private Veale were actually to be reserved that day. The attack got underway, and just as predicted by Captain Martin, his company, as it crossed the danger spot, received a terrible raking by a hail of machine gun fire. Elsewhere, though, the attack prospered, and during the course of the day, to keep the momentum going, the brigade commander fed in company after company of 8th Devons. Finally, it was the turn of C Company, commanded by Lieutenant Savill, and including in its rank Private Veale. Lieutenant Savill went forward and saw the wreckage of the previous attacks lying around the danger spot, and he simply decided to take his company elsewhere. Further up the valley, out of sight of the machine gun, they got across and into the German trenches, thus earning the undying respect and gratitude of the soldiers. At the end of the day, the attack here had been modestly successful. 8th and 9th Devons had eventually reached their objectives, but the cost was horrendous. Nearly 1,000 Devons lay dead, dying or missing, nearly 50% of their strength. Theodore Veale survived, But like many of the others, he must have been one very shocked soldier as he marched away from the battlefield that night. After 14 days of further fighting, the British Fourth Army closed up to the second German position on the ridge line across this valley. It was almost as strong as the position they had attacked on the 1st of July. Trenches, barbed wire and dugouts. But this attack wasn't to be in broad daylight, preceded by a week-long bombardment. The Fourth Army were to assemble in this particularly wide bit of no man's land under the cover of darkness, and then still before dawn assault the German position after a 15-minute hurricane bombardment, short and incredibly sharp. The infantry, including the Devons and Private Veale, were on top of the Germans while they were still struggling to get out of their dugouts. The attack was a complete success. It would seem that the British Army had found its recipe for success, one that they would surely use again in the coming days.
The next objective of the Fourth Army was the capture of High and Delville Woods. 8th Devons was therefore, for the third time in 3 weeks, to go over the top and attack the German trenches between the two woods.
On the night of the 19th, 20th of July, the Devons came up out of Caterpillar Valley and along this road and reached this point here, one of the many crucifix corners on the Western Front. This crucifix is in fact the original. It stood here throughout the battle, and actually Christ bears the scars of the Battle of the Somme. Battalion headquarters was established here, and the assault companies, including Private Veale, moved up along this track to their start lines.
Using the same formula as before, 20 Brigade attacked after a short bombardment, during which the Devons and the Gordons had crawled forward towards Black Road. Charging forward at 03:35 hours, they found the enemy trench abandoned. Continuing in advance through Standing Corner and across a rise, they came under heavy fire from Wood Trench and were halted. The Germans were not to be caught out again. The Devons fell back to Black Trench, leaving the wounded behind. Private Veale, however, saw a khaki-clad arm waving from the corn and resolved to rescue the wounded comrade.
Private Veale crawled out through the standing corn. There was a reasonable amount of cover because, of course, mid-July it was fully grown and nearing ripeness. And of course, in those days, the varieties planted here on the Somme were much taller, so he had some cover. But he reached a point just 10 yards from the German trench, and there he found the person who had been waving at them. It was Lieutenant Savill, and he was seriously wounded. As Veale said in a letter home to his mum, he was determined to rescue him, come what may. And he pulled Lieutenant Savill back about another 15 yards away from the German trench, which meant that the Germans were far less likely to try and capture him. He then went back across no man's land to collect some water, and this was the first of several trips backwards and forwards across no man's land he made that day. Returning to Lieutenant Savill, Veale made him as comfortable as possible with the water, and then once again crawled back across no man's land to Black Trench, where he assembled a rescue party of a corporal and 2 other private soldiers from the Devons. Together they returned back out into the corn, and they must have got disorientated, because the corporal knelt up above the level of the corn to see where they were, and almost immediately he was hit in the centre of the forehead by a bullet. This not unnaturally spooked the two young privates who wanted to go back, and Veale sent them off, leaving himself with a rubber sheet to act as a stretcher. He crawled back to Lieutenant Savill, put him on the sheet, and painfully slowly, and remember all the while under fire, dragged him to the relative safety of a shell hole. And there he left him again to go back and get help. Back here at the site of Black Trench, the post-attack reorganisation was now well underway, and Private Veale found Lieutenant Duff and Padre Cross, and together they assembled another rescue party, this time including a Lewis gunner. They went out again into the corn, and inevitably, with a much larger party, they very soon attracted German attention, and they took fire. With Private Veale leading them, they reached Lieutenant Savill and started to pull him back that last 100 yards to safety here in Black Trench. All the while out there, Private Veale bravely remained with the Lewis gunner, giving covering fire during this whole protracted period of rescue.
During the 20th of July 1916 on the Somme, for gallantry and conduct beyond the call of duty, showing determined courage, Private Veale was awarded the Devonshire Regiment's 2nd Victoria Cross.